Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the second of three events being held this week as part of the Revisiting the LA Riots 30 Years Later series, a series commemorating the 30th anniversary of the LA Uprising, an event that Korean Americans refer to as Sa-i-gu. My name is Stefan Chosa, an assistant professor of sociology and women's ethnic studies here at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs, or UCCS, and I will serve as the host and moderator throughout this series. We're currently broadcasting live from the unceded territories of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, Apache, Comanche, Kiowa, Lakota, Pueblo, and Shoshone peoples and nations, otherwise known as the state of Colorado. Today's virtual event is supported by the following groups and offices at UCCS: the Social Sciences Symposium Series, the Office for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, the Global Intercultural Research Center, or GLINT, and the Matrix Center. Thank you all sincerely for your support. We have the honor of being joined virtually from Los Angeles today by Dr. Kyeyoung Park, who will give a presentation of her most recently published monograph, LA Rising: Korean Relations with Blacks and Latinos after Civil Unrest. Dr. Kyeyoung Park is a professor of anthropology and Asian American studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. She is the author of the book, LA Rising: Korean Relations with Blacks and Latinos after Civil Unrest, published by Lexington Books. Her first book, The Korean American Dream: Immigrants and Small Business in New York City by Cornell University Press, is the winner of the Association for Asian American Studies Book Award. Besides these two monographs, she has co-written and co-edited 4 more books: Korean Americans' Ethnic Relationship in Los Angeles, Korean American Economy. The following 2 are in Korean. I'll do my best to read through these. 태평양을 넘어서 글로벌 시대 재미한인의 삶과 활동, or Cross the Pacific: The Lives of Korean Americans and Their Socio-Political Engagement in the Global Age, and 글로벌 시대 재미한인 연구, 이론적 리뷰와 새로운 방향의 모색: Korean Americans in the Global Age, Critical Literature Reviews in Search of New Theoretical Frameworks. Her current research projects are about the Korean American communities in Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay, and second-generation Korean American transnationalism. Let's all give a warm welcome to Dr. Kyeyoung Park. Thank you for joining us today. So Dr. Park will have the virtual floor for the next hour or so, leaving roughly 20 to 25 minutes for Q&A. Viewers are encouraged to ask their own questions using the Q&A function, not the chat function, and we will try to respond to the questions in order that they are received. And I will place a link to Dr. Park's book in the chat. This is a link to the publisher's page. You can, of course, purchase the book elsewhere as well. But without further ado, Dr. Park.
Okay, greetings from Los Angeles, and good morning or there, good afternoon. And I am thankful to Professor Stephen Saw and others for organizing today's my talk. All right, so let me share my screen. All right, so since you are already familiar with the cover of my book, so I'm gonna just, okay. All right, so this is the table of content of my book, and it has 3 parts, and first one is locating, placing Korean American, African American, and Latino Americans in South LA, and has introduction and political economy of ethno-racial identities in South LA. And part 2 is Black Korean tension before the unrest, and it has 3 chapters. First one is disentangling race and racism. Second one is culture, race, and clash. And fourth one is triangulating class at the crossroads of race and ethnicity. And part 3 is Black, Latino, and Korean relations after the unrest, how race and ethnicity have become the expressor of changing class relations. And chapter 5 is class relations of surveillance. 6 is changing the business plan. Korean merchants try to reintegrate into the South LA community. And chapter 7, ethnic tension in the aftermath, rebuilding LA without liquor stores. And part 4 is my conclusion and has 2 chapters. Chapter 8 is an analysis of Latino-Korean relations in the workplace, Latino perspectives in the aftermath of the 1992 Los Angeles Civil Unrest. And last chapter is the racial cartography of post-unrest. All right, since my book is kind of lengthy, over 300 pages, so I'm going to talk about very selectively. So let me start with the thesis. I believe Black orientation and also 1992 Los Angeles Civil Unrest involved 2 major ethnic tensions. First, Black orientation, which is seen as the most controversial ethnic tension in US history. And then the other one is Latino-Korean relations. And I do conceptualize both Black orientation and Latino-Korean relations as racialized, classed, and cultural conflict. And I do analyze in relation to these various analytical dimensions of inequality. And I suppose here that minorities, racial minorities in the US are positioned in a different way, you know, in relation to US racial hegemony, capitalism, and national identity. They are impacted in a different way. And then also this, you know, differential racialization, or those things also further impact on nature of interactions among minorities. And in the end, it does create socio-political barriers and obstruct meaningful social relationships among African Americans, Latino Americans, and Korean Americans. All right, so then my research question would be how these different axes of inequality, race, class, culture, and citizenship really impacted, you know, different racial minorities, and then also further impacted on the nature of interactions and relationships among minorities and also majorities. So I'm analyzing here, and in the end, these 4 axes of inequality, race and racism, class and class conflict, culture and cultural clash, and politics citizenship, form more hierarchical, multi-tiered, what I call racial cartography, that kind of relations. So I think that is affected how LA residents, you know, thought about and interacted with each other. So I think that explains. All right, so theoretically, I am using neo-Marxist. I do critique of political economy and Gramscian analysis with the emphasis on racialized capitalism, and also critical race class theory, emphasizing the role of state and non-state. Non-state is referring to market sector, or everyday life or cultural arena. So non-state and non-state racial formations. Looking at various public and political spheres, such as media, police, court, the government, educational settings, financial settings, and civil society. All right, so I named it as my theoretical framework as unitary conceptual framework on inequality. So those are about intersectionally relating it to with the question of race and racism in relation to class and class conflict and cultural clash and politics of citizenship. So really, I see this exists as a kind of intersectional nexus. So I wanted to point out really the limitations of the single axis framework. That means a single axis of inequality. Try to explain it only as a matter of, race and racial conflict, or maybe class. I don't think anybody has done it, but anyway. And then also to show that how different groups, different racial minorities have been racialized in related yet distinct ways. That's what I say, differential racialization. And also, I do emphasize the importance of social class, citizenship, and culture in structuring interactions. All right, so in terms of my research methodology, I used processual analysis. That means that I don't believe in there is only single cause, which produced Black Korean tension or 1992 Los Angeles Civil Unrest. There have been multiple causes, and then also there have been multiple players, not just African Americans and Korean Americans or Latinos, but also white Americans, structurally have been also involved. And I try to look at mechanism and under what circumstances, it produced ethnic tension. All right, and I used also intercessory ethnography. That means that, in some senses, I would be seen as an insider, as a fellow Korean American to study fellow ethnic, Korean immigrant merchant. But then in relation to African Americans and Latinos, I'm not an insider, but I think this is how I used. I'm saying here is that emphasizing critical dialogue and social responsibility. That means that I wasn't happy about just collecting stories and discussions, but I think in some senses, because I'm not just an anthropologist and researcher, I will be seen as a leader, community leader or activist. So I do have a certain responsibility. So I engaged in some senses. This is the way I talk about my self-reflexivity. But anyway, so I was, and my primary method was ethnographic interviews. So that means really engaged in open-ended discussions, and particularly racial discourse, and then some participant observation, and also direct observation, like chapter 5 was based on direct observation of the interactions at Korean-owned liquor store between the merchant and customers, and no interviews, so I used. All right, so just to refresh our memory, almost 30 years ago, African-American teenager was shot and killed by a Korean grocer over a really dispute about shoplifting, and Judge Carlin, fined only $500 and no prison term and 400 hours community service. And that is why my African-American interviewees were outraged at this, no prison term. And for them, it was similar to the way that white police officers, they received not guilty verdict in Rodney King beating trial. So I think that how we look at it here, very racialized criminal justice system that I can point out. So these were the flyers that at the time, boycotting in that Empire Market. And this woman owns Buddha Market at the time. Koreans were called as Buddha head, in some cases in South Africa. All right, so I will say that right now, so far, the existing literature failed to point out the central role of really of white racism in this conflict and the underlying racial hierarchy in America. So I look at here really white, Asian, Black racial hierarchy. And in various arenas, as I mentioned, media, judicial, financial, education, or public sector, or politics, or civil society. So I do talk about instigating role of whiteness. That means that how to explain, how to make sense of the fact that Korean grocer received the kind of honorary white sentence, not a black sentence if she killed, white child. And if she were a black merchant, she could receive different sentence, right? So this black orientation was not a diet. People, even these days, even after 30 years, they tended to think that there was something wrong with or fault with either or both African Americans or Korean Americans. But I would say that it was a triad, and we have to factor into their respective relationships to white, so here I'm talking about just structurally, not individual white Judge Carlin, but it's more structurally at our court. So the sentencing of two for shooting Hollins, but I will say that Judge Carlin justified really based on her reading of her interpretation of criminal law in the US, that will have to, secure the right to conduct trade freely in this capitalist society. And Sun Ja-doo didn't have any prior criminal record, so she justified as kind of self-defense. And the market has been previously harassed and vandalized by gang members, maybe, more than 40 times. And just to refresh our memory, really it happened very at the same time, although the killing of Latasha Hollins and also sentencing, right, to Korean girls happened a little bit before, actually 6 months before it happened, but week before the sentence was confirmed, actually the sentence to Korean girls was confirmed. So it was, we can say, very similar time, right? And I think Rodney King beating and white police officers, their non-guilty verdict that sparked really the 1992 Los Angeles civil unrest and worst civil unrest. And just as a social fact, and it led to almost 60 people, you know, died or being killed. And but I think half of all the arrestees were Latinos, and one out of three were African Americans, and probably 1/3 of the people who were, you know, killed at that time were Latinos. And at that time, there are only 1.6% of the population in LA were Korean Americans, but near half the financial damage has been done to Korean American community, particularly Korean immigrant business owners. So 2,300 Korean owned businesses, they lost their businesses or damaged or looted or burnt. And that amounted to 3,000, near 3,000 Korean immigrant business owners. Yeah, so I think that has been the social fact. In at the beginning, really, it has started with well-organized rally, really condemning, you know, non-guilty verdict. And what happened in 1992 was really, depending on when and where you are looking at it, was, you know, a kind of postmodern. It was juxtaposition of order and disorder and well-organized protest and rally. And at some point, it was developed into opportunistic looting, you know. Yeah. And this is the entry to Koreatown. And this is what happened to my interviewees, Korean American interviewees. Everything has been destroyed, and it was a liquor store, and this interviewee's fellow, you know, Korean Americans, I mean, Christian, I mean, he was a Catholic. They didn't want him to rebuild actually liquor store. So they told him, you know, if you're gonna rebuild the liquor store, we are not gonna support you, you know. But anyway, so, all right, you see here, it's kind of graffitis, right? And in the aftermath of the 1992 Los Angeles civil unrest, then there are definitely condemning Rodney King beating, that he couldn't really stand up, you know. More than 50 times he was beaten, and he was assumed under PCP. It turns out to be wrong. And then there is also mention about Latasha Hollins, you know, African-American teenager. All right, so in Koreatown, we had the largest peace rally, 100,000 people gathered. You can see, and other people also joined. All right, so analytically, this is how I analyze. Black orientation can be, I mean, I'm visualizing it here, that how and why there has been Black orientation. And we can see here the dimension of race and racism played negatively. And citizenship also, politics of citizenship played negatively. Culture and cultural clash and class conflict all played very negatively. That means it contributed to Black Korean tension. I mean, first of all, race and racism. As I already mentioned, when I talk about race and racism, I'm referring to white racism, right? In the area of like media, criminal justice system, even police, you know, government and civil society, financial institution, educational settings, those things. But I also do talk about subaltern racism, that unfortunately racial minorities, they also had prejudices and racism, what I call anti-Black racism and also anti-Asian racism. So anti-Black racism among Korean immigrant merchants, I'm referring to their, you know, the way they see the differences as if it's grounded in, those differences are grounded in biogenetic differences, okay? And at the same time, African-American customers, they do have anti-Asian prejudices. And I think I'm talking about here Orientalist racism and nativist racism. Really seeing, you know, that Korean immigrant merchant not as Americans or less Americans, or they are, you know, really, they don't really belong here, like in the Orientalist way, as if they are not a really modern, you know, modern citizen in the US, okay? All right. And Korean Latino relations here. These analytical categories of inequality operates in a different way. We didn't have a Korean Latino tension, but I think still it was called as kind of hidden conflict. And actually in Koreatown during unrest, those you know, people who participated in looting, probably not necessarily burning Korean-owned businesses in Koreatown. They were not all from really African Americans from South LA. It really included local residents and customers in Koreatown, and they were actually new immigrants and refugees from Mexico and Central America. All right, so in this case, Korean Latino relations, race and racism and politics of citizenship operates really unlike Black Korean tension, kind of positively, but culture and cultural clash and class conflict, you know, plays negative roles. And I think I wanted to pay attention to this dimension of class and conflict. I mean, Korean Americans and Koreans and Latinos, they interact each other in many different ways, you know, unlike Korean Black relations in a multi, you know, settings, I would say that. So, but in many cases, they were the employer and employee, because majority workforce at Korean-owned business establishment, they were and still now they are Latinos. So there have been labor issues, and it could easily develop into ethnic or racial tension, because it involves, you know, two different racial minorities and two different ethnic groups. In the culture, but I mean, okay, so Koreans and Latinos, they encounter each other as employer and employees, but also as merchant and customer, and as fellow, you know, classmate or schoolmate, and then also fellow employees. So they meet each other in many different settings and many different ways. So merchant customer interaction is only one of those, you know, multi settings. All right, and culture and cultural clash, I would say that it doesn't always play negatively, and it could develop in even positively, you know, or it could be negatively. Okay, so I think it's there. And race and citizenship, race and racial tension, or politics of citizenship doesn't play necessarily negatively. So in the end, it lead to 2 degrees of separation, or you know, or exclusion, and 2 degrees of convergence or exclusion. So in the end, I assess we are a kind of respectful quotient. Yeah, my chapter 8 is entirely about Latino perspectives and how they view, how they experience Latino-Korean relations. All right, so now I want to talk about a little bit more specifically my analytical interventions. I will say it has been 1990 has been a really turning point in South LA. Transitioned from white over black or white or black, the kind of dichotomous bipolar racial formation to multipolar racial formation. And when I say multipolar racial formation, I'm not just talking about demographically, it has been, you know, colorful, okay, multiracial. All right, so I see here that multipolar relationship has been really negotiated in a complex way. And in the end, we can see visually racial cartography has been being unfolded, okay? And it is inflected on multiple axes of inequality, such as class, citizenship, and culture. So I would say that this is better to address the increasing complexity of racial politics and racial identity today. And also, this is the way to grasp the dynamics of why supremacy operates in a different way in different contexts. If we just, you know, keep using only white, black binary, we're, you know, miss, okay? All right, so obviously I am really inspired by political scientist Claire Kim's seminar work and theory of racial triangulation. And I believe I am advancing it probably in a different way, her mother. And particularly I adopt her idea notion of a field of racial positions, you know. So at least we need like 2 dimensions, right? Multiple axes of inequality. Yeah, otherwise we can grasp really different racialization processes and their ranking. However, I think I add here also different ideas that quote-unquote cognitive mapping. And this is the way that people in South LA, they related to their racial and, you know, cultural reality or even class reality. Okay, so racial hierarchies and also relationship. To talk about racial hierarchy is not sufficient. We have to think about really relationship, multiple relationship between majorities and minorities, and also among minorities, I would say that. So it does form cognitive map. So this is different from probably physical, It could be based on social as well as physical. All right. So, but I differ from Claire Kim that she related to only race, but I do relate to additional forms of inequality underlying Black Korean tension and also 1992 Los Angeles Civil Unrest. And those are class, citizenship, and culture, in addition to racial power and order. Right, so I am continuing here to explain, further explain racial cartography, right? So people in South LA, how they chart out their historical relationship to each other. It isn't necessarily really, it's slightly different from the physical relationship, I could say that. And really foreground dialectical relationship between whiteness, blackness, Latinoness, and Asian Americanness. And really, I believe that there are unequal and differential power relations, not just between white and black, but also between other racial categories, pertaining to race, class, and citizenship. So, in other words, how do people in South LA, African Americans and Latinos and Koreans, view others and themselves with regards to their racial status, rights and entitlement, hierarchy, and also racial distance and racial tension, how they really talk about, and also how they act, and understand and act upon really racial categories in differentiating themselves from others. So in this racial cartography, still whites are at the top, in South LA, although white Americans are not visible, but still 1/3 of the property when I conducted research were owned by white Americans, and white Americans do appear as police officers, and then African Americans and Native Americans at the right and bottom. So, and also I will soon explain visually, Asian Americans and Latinos are not given, really not granted full national belonging and symbolic integration. So they are holding a liminal state, despite a century of presence, contribution, and struggle in the U.S. as if just they are transient or they just came here, yeah. So this, when you look at the field of racial positions, then I'm using local schemes, and there are two important schemes, and one is vertical one. Y-axis is a proxy for class, economic indicators, but most specifically, I use taxable income, after tax, how much they have, how much they made, and then the horizontal one, because people in South LA, they will say that how much money you make isn't sufficient, there is other important really variable, and that is rights of prior occupancy. That means that it's a territoriality, who have been here, and it's a proxy for citizenship, and also politics of national belonging, and then also symbolic integration and legitimacy. So it varies a lot, So, and I see here that different racial minorities have been stratified, and it's unequal, So there have been significant gaps in socioeconomic status between these groups. But it does imply US has become multipolar. But my model is kind of flexible. So as more Korean Americans or Asian Americans, they live here longer and they make critical contributions, then their position will be moved to the right. And African Americans, if they make progress in terms of socioeconomic indicator, then their position is gonna go up. Okay, and then also then the distance between Korean Americans and African Americans would be shortened, so it will change. All right, so racial distancing is very important for my analysis. So I think it's a really extension of the idea of social distance, I mean, now under pandemic, we do talk about the importance of social distancing, but the idea that how different racial minorities, they would feel with each other, whether they feel close to each other, or even though they live next to each other in close proximity, but they don't necessarily feel, they are close to each other. All right. And I also critique the previous studies, looking at ethnic relationship, whether good or bad. I think that's very problematic, too simplistic. And I use sociologist Vanessa Ribas, also notion of prismatic engagement. That means that when people talk about their cognitive mapping and racial distancing, it's inflected. It has been affected by something else, and that and it's not really directly or pure. So their sense of their position or others' position has been affected by the quote-unquote distorting optic of the prism of white dominance, so it has been kind of inflected by how, white supremacists, they were talking about different racial groups or placing different racial minorities. So minorities themselves have been affected. And also, the other notion is, again, sociologist Michel Ramont, symbolic boundaries. And, it's different from social boundaries, right? And how they understand and act on racial categories to differentiate themselves from others. All right, so we do see, at least in 1990s, and not now, I would say that, African Americans, they felt threatened. So in a way, during the unrest, there was a defensive, violent backlash by African Americans in South LA to the rapid influx of immigrants, by non-Black minorities in the commercial area, by Koreans, Korean merchant, and in the residential area in the 1990s. Before the unrest, it was really equally 50%, slightly more African Americans than Latinos, but right now it has become predominantly Latino neighborhood. So African Americans, their narratives of national belonging it goes like this. Whether other groups had suffered as much as African Americans, or oppressed or suffered, and whether other groups have really contributed to the creation of this country. I mean, the idea is whether, African Americans shed their blood, sweat, and tears, to build this society. And yet still they were not really, granted really full equality. And they had to fight, they had to protest, to attain civil rights, and yet still they were not granted full equality. So I think this is this is a really a narrative, and therefore saying we are true Americans, but Koreans and Latinos, they are unwanted, politically important immigrants. They are not committed, they are not invested. They are not participating. So they see when Korean immigrants dominate all the businesses in African American neighborhood, they rather see it as unearned opportunity at their expense. They think it lack legitimacy. At the same time, even Latinos and Korean Americans, they view African Americans as politically, socially, and culturally an insider. Of course, we know there is a continuing, anti-Black racism and police violence and economic racism. But I think we are talking about in South LA, where Latinos are doing worse than actually African Americans. And most politicians were African Americans. All right, so this is how I visualize in the nation. So I see a 1776 as the turning point, the foundation of independent, nationhood of the U.S. Yeah, so that we can see that's how really white Americans, you see it horizontally, that's their entry point. But before then, right, we had the Native Americans pre-1700 and African Americans, since 1619, and white Americans, entered the year 1776, and Latinos after U.S.-Mexican War, 1848, and Asian Americans here approximately since the late 20th century, although Chinese started to immigrate in the mid 19th century. So this, Y dimension is really household income above taxable minimum, okay? And most minorities, they don't make enough money that they can socially reproduce themselves. They can't. And this X dimension is really the politics of citizenship, territoriality, centuries present within US since 1776. So these things, everybody's position can be, it's flexible. It can be moved to the right or to up, okay? All right, in Los Angeles, it's very different because when you look at who founded the Los Angeles city, then of course we had the Native Americans, and it was by actually multiracial people, mestizo or indigenous, right, from Mexico, and also Africans who were brought by Spanish. So they are more positioned to the right. And yeah, so I think it's when you look at LA cartography, is different. And in South Central, Latinos' position is lower than African Americans and Koreans and white Americans, not visible, but as kind of ghost. All right, so I see it has a transitioned multipolar racial formation, and 1992 Los Angeles Civil Unrest was a way to contest this kind of newly, established multipolar racial cartography. And in this way, Asian Americans and Latinos, they were subject to differential racialization, different from African Americans, and also different from each other and from the state and civil society. And there are elements of race acting ideologically whiteness, performing whiteness, like a Korean grocer as honorary white, right? And even some African American politicians, they called for, like anti-immigrant sentiment. So it led to subaltern racism and also question of interracial justice. So people of color have been victims of white supremacy, but also complicit in white supremacy as well. And it is influenced by class inequality and immigrant citizenship status. And we see pan-ethnic racialization. That means after the unrest, then there is a coalition building between established Chicano and Mexican American leadership and community activists, and also Central American, and then also racial interpellation. Some Latinos become blackened, and also cross-racial class formation among Korean Americans and Latinos over immigrant rights issues and various, labor issues such as hotel workers, garment factory workers, justice campaign, and also restaurant workers and supermarket workers, their justice campaign. So for instance, Kiwa, Koreatown Immigrant Workers Alliance, they advocated on behalf of really Latino and also Korean workers, sometimes against Korean business owners and employers. Immigrant rights. And at the same time, in South LA, there has been also coalition building among African Americans and Latinos, like organizing security officers and also even environmental justice. And in the aftermath of the unrest, there has been this kind of campaign, rebuilding South Central without liquor stores. So unfortunately, it targeted mostly Korean-owned liquor stores, but anyway. All right, so after 20 years later or 25 years later, there has been an effort to reconciliate among family members of the Latasha Hallins, who was killed by Korean grocer and Korean American community leaders. In South Central has become predominantly Latino neighborhood, and also unlike 1990s, right now Latinos have been more or less better integrated into landscape of civil society and public sectors, even African American community-based organizations. Okay, so I think that's it. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Park, for that very interesting and nuanced examination of racisms, and race relations in Los Angeles post-1992. I will encourage those in the audience to, again, pose questions should you have any. I have some questions in the meantime that I was hoping to ask you that I think will help to unpack some of these histories and concepts for the audience, and then perhaps begin to think about like what this means for the present, right? Because towards the end of the presentation, especially, you showed some imagery of what cross-racial coalition building looks like now and how the past has affected the present. And so I'll begin with some maybe introductory foundational questions that I think will help to get us to that larger point. I was wondering, first and foremost, could you help to explain a little bit how these interactions came to be in the first place? So you mentioned how there were a number of points that led up to, let's say, for example, the Black Asian, Black Korean tensions during 1992, for example. How did it come to be that we see Korean merchants in South LA, that we see Korean liquor store owners and and corner shop owners in portions of Los Angeles where we normally wouldn't see, like, let's say, white merchants or other merchants of color, for example. How did this come to be, and how did this perhaps affect the relationships that were built within those communities before 1992?
Okay, Stephen, I think I'm not 100% clear about your question. Maybe I think instead of giving you wrong answer, can you repeat your question?
Oh, sure, yeah. So the question that I asked was like what are the actions that led up to 1992? Because you mentioned there were a number of like issues, number of interactions that contribute to civil unrest in Los Angeles in the early 90s. One of the questions that I asked, I guess, was specifically were why, for example, were there Korean merchants in South LA? What types of interactions were there between Korean merchants and the African American community in Los Angeles before the 90s, and how does this then lead up to tensions and issues stemming then contributing to then the LA riots, for example?
Okay, all right, great. I believe since the probably late 70s, but mostly in the 80s, but I think it has started in the 70s, I would say that. Increasingly, Korean immigrants, they moved into South LA. I think without really knowing much about the community or histories about the community, I think what happened was Korean immigrant merchant, because they couldn't afford to buy businesses in other areas, such as like West LA, my neighborhood, or where UCLA is located. They couldn't afford, so they ended up really businesses in the inner city. So I think really without knowing much about the history, like for instance, in 1965, we had apparently similar race riot, and it was called Watch Revolt. And at that time, most local business owners were Jewish American and maybe other white American. And at the time, very similar. Again, riot had started initially sparked by police brutality, because again, African-American motorist was stopped for speeding. He was driving actually his pregnant wife, and there wasn't any nearby hospital. Maybe he speeded and he stopped, and when he was stopped, and soon he was surrounded by local people, and they couldn't believe, they were witnessing the way they've been experiencing police violence and the way they were treated by the police. So it led to Watch Revolt, and they had also complaints about local merchants. Okay, everything. So it was very almost the same thing, deja vu, I would say that. But I think back to your question, actually, initially, I hear that like even other places in the nation, initially Korean merchants were welcome. And African Americans, they had the expectation. Like, oh, maybe we're gonna be treated better, because Koreans they are not the white people, they were minorities, so they thought that they would be treated better than previous white American or Jewish American merchant. But then soon they found out that they were disappointed because it wasn't different, they didn't hire local people. And so I think, in the 90s, actually, there's increasingly in the nation, like in New York City and Los Angeles, increasingly there is a problem involving Korean merchants and their customers, mostly African Americans. And yeah, so I think increasingly media coined the term Black Korean tension, and then I would say that increasingly there has been a organized boycott and protest in New York and LA. So I think and also before the 1992 Los Angeles Civil Unrest, there have been really many cases. I mean, people called it as just in general Black Korean tension, but that's like very problematic. I would say that the term, like for instance, almost like 25 Korean merchants were being shot and killed, you know, before and after the unrest. I think in South LA, and I think even more of Korean merchants were being robbed and beaten, you know, and also I think there were controversial cases like this kind of, you know, the killing of Latasha Hollins, right, by Korean girls. And then there is also another shooting by another Korean merchant, but that was somehow ruled as like justifiable defense, you know, in South LA, okay? So I would say that really in South LA, there has been almost like a year-long protest, even organized by, you know, Brotherhood Crusade. Is a Black nationalist group, and the leader, yeah, was Danny Bakewell. Actually, now he owns the LA Sentinel, the largest African American newspaper. So I think this was what's going on, you know. So in a way, some people were not, I mean, including myself, we are not surprised, okay? It was like building, you know, up, tension, boiling. But on the other hand, you know, when media really coined the term Black Korean tension, and I wouldn't say they manufactured, because it isn't like they manufactured something, it didn't exist, you know, it wasn't like that, but they coined the term and they reified what the term. What I'm saying here is that even these days, when they talk about Black Korean tension, they think it's kind of intrinsic or inherent, you know. I mean, in other words, that means that as if like Black Korean tension means it was a fault with both Blacks and Koreans, and they were the perpetrator, and they are, so therefore they are responsible. Nobody else is responsible, you know. And they think that inherently African Americans, Korean Americans, they don't like each other, and when they meet, then they try to, you know, fight, okay? So I think even up to now, that is how it is viewed, and really that is the challenge. I mean, the really the society's attitude is okay. It was a problem with Koreans and Blacks. Apparently they didn't get along each other, so they should resolve it. So even 30 years later, the mainstream society's attitude is, did they repent? Did they, you know, did they try to improve their, you know, behavior or attitude, try to treat each other better, you know? That is the only thing that they are interested in taking a look at it, without realizing that in South LA, really, it has been going on, you know, and because usually this kind of tension happened involving outside the merchant, you know, such as Jewish American merchant and Korean American merchant, and now in South Central Korean Americans, they don't dominate the businesses. It has been very much diversified. So we have South Asian American and Southeast Asian American, and also significant number of the businesses are owned by Latinos, you know. So I think really, even in 1930s in Harlem, we had a race riot, and usually it's about over dispute about shoplifting, you know, and then it involves white outsider merchants. So from African American perspective, how come except to themselves, everybody else would come in and own the businesses and dominate the businesses, you know? So I think I don't know whether that's what you meant, but that's the kind of context, you know? Yeah.
No, that was perfect, and it actually helps to segue directly into the next question, some of which you've already addressed. So much is being said popularly over the past few months about the ongoing conflict and tensions between Blacks and Asians in general, in light of the heightened anti-Asian violence during the pandemic, and ongoing today. How do you feel that your research addresses issues and concerns related to these popular discussions? And what is perhaps not being given enough attention in these popular discussions? For example, perhaps there isn't enough attention given to the positioning of Latinx communities within this conflict or tension. I for one, I'll add, I really appreciate the attention that you give to Black, Asian, Black, Korean tensions, while also then acknowledging the limited ways that this tension has been properly portrayed within the media. So recognizing there's something there, but also that the way that it's been covered is also very much problematic. But going back to the question again, the question was more specifically, how do you feel your research addresses these popular portrayals?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, because it really, the mainstream discourse or mainstream media's their framing of what happened in 1992 was really, you know, they deflated, right? Deflected our attention on really white racism, you know, white Black conflict or those things into only Black Korean tension. And forgetting that actually Latinos were the really victims, and also we can say villains or victimized, you see, actually, because what I'm saying here is that, as I mentioned, that like Pico Union next to Koreatown and South LA, it's a Latino neighborhood, was also looted and damaged, okay? Latino owned the businesses. So after Korean owned the businesses, almost 12% of damaged businesses were owned by Latinos, you know? And also, as I mentioned, really half of the people who are arrested for participating in the riot, they were Latinos, and 1/3 of those people, they were deported. You know, and then also politician Republicans, they would say, oh, they didn't know Latinos could be as bad as Blacks, you know. So I think really, in a way that is completely erased. I think, you know, Latino, whether Latinos as victims or as victimizers or villains, you see. So I think that I want to really set the record correct here, you know. But I think back to your question, unfortunately, this, you know, pandemic-led anti-Asian, you know, violence and attack, those things definitely made it very difficult to maintain and build and maintain any coalition building or alliances between African Americans and Korean Americans or Asian Americans. Let's just say Asian Americans, okay? That's the bottom line. But I think, you know, in a nutshell, again, Asian American communities is kind of divided. So some conservative Asian Americans, they called for, you know, more punitive method, so increasing funding for policing and pressing for legislature, because apparently we have some state, it's not illegal, that hate crime, in some state, you see. And in some states, police, they have never collected any statistics even about hate crime or hate incident. And hate crime and hate incident is it's a legal term, and it's very tricky, So anyway, so, some Asian Americans, they pushed for this kind of method, right? Law and order, that kind of things. But then, other Asian Americans, they realized that if we push for, this kind of punitive method, then it might lead to more criminalized of, racial minorities, okay? And so therefore, and then there are also other reasons, so they opposed the kind of method, okay? And it's a little bit more complex here, why they thought that punitive method will contribute to further criminalize racial minorities such as African Americans, And the reason is many anti-Asian violence and attack, mainstream media, again, they showed very high profile cases, and in which assailants were African Americans or some Latinos, okay? So really visually, they showed all the cases. So people mistakenly think that these anti-Asian hate incident, and violent attack was only perpetrated by African Americans. Okay, but I think in reality, already it showed that actually in the nation, most hate crimes have been, even anti-Asian hate crimes have been perpetrated by white Americans in the nation. But I think, mainstream media, they look at what's happening in the metropolitan area, like New York, then, minorities are usually living in the urban area, right? So I think, and again, conservative media, they thought it's a great chance, going around saying that, these hate crimes are committed by African Americans, not by white Americans. So I think, but I think what we need to think about here is that this hate crime, or let's just say anti-Asian hate incident and violence and attack, when there is this kind of attack, actually there is a intersectionality. Like homeless issues, we all know now, homelessness is a kind of complicated issue. It's not just, poverty issue, you see. It combines, it intersects with housing crisis or financial crisis, mental health issues, because many people were kicked out from whatever by President Reagan, right? From those institutions, then they are on the street, you see. But anyway, so this even hate incident or anti-Asian violence and attack, this kind of things, it intersects with, other issues. I would say that really, again, poverty issues and also mental health issues, because some cases turned out to be, they are mentally ill, they are homeless, not all the cases, but I think it really does interact with other issues, I would say that. And yeah, so I think that is why, but I mean, I would say that at the same time, also it doesn't make sense that we're underplay the fact that it did involve African Americans, in some cases Latinos, because, as you know, since President Trump, right, going around calling it as China virus or Kung Fu virus, then many people, they are kind of interpellated, I would say, that, and then they think that this is a chance to be patriotic, you know. Okay, so, you know, I will join, you know, I will show them how I am also American and patriotic, you know, including minorities, I would say that. So, anyway, that's why, back to your question, that unfortunately people in the Asian American community, they are confused, you know, because I think they don't know everything about this, what's going on, and then yeah, so I think definitely it was a challenge to build and maintain alliances and yeah, and coalition building, but I think at the same time, you know, we had this kind of racial reckoning, right, with I mean, national reckoning with racial justice in the aftermath of police murder of George Floyd, right? And from 16 to 25 million people, including Asian Americans and Korean Americans, they took it to the street. Okay, and so what I'm saying is that we had like even Koreatown rally, you know, Koreatowns for K-Town for Black Lives Matter. And actually, even last Saturday, we had a conference in LA and to commemorate the 30th anniversary of the 1992 Los Angeles Civil Unrest. And we had African-American Black Lives Matter activists, you know, and then also Latino, you know, community activists from South LA. So I think what I'm saying here is that those Korean Americans, when they joined the Black Lives Matter protest, they were welcome and appreciated. So I think unlike in 1990s, you know, now I think it has been kind of visible, and also African American and Latino politicians and community leaders and activists, they do join when we have a rally condemning anti-Asian, you know, hate crime and violence. So I don't think, you know, we can easily generalize, I would say that. So I think there are these kind of challenges, and at the same time still kind of misunderstanding, you know. I mean, in the future, I do like to write an article about this kind of whatever hate crime, those things. I mean, really examining critically even that philosophically, epistemologically, I would say that, you know. But anyway, so that is really what's going on. And in LA, actually, you know, there has been rapid increase in terms of really anti-Asian violence and hate crime. But in recent decades, still in LA, African Americans were the victim of hate crime than anybody else. And that was actually committed by Latinos, you know, so the largest minority. So it's kind of complex, I would say that. And yeah, so it's, although we have a challenge, but I think what is important is really in the long term, you know, I mean, because we didn't have this kind of alliances or, you know, things like that between Asian Americans and African Americans in the 1990s, you know, but now, in addition to Korean Latino coalition building, now explicitly, you know, so I hope that in the long term, really either contribute, I would say that, to really shift the relationship, I would say that, but yeah, so I think that is what I said, but I think I didn't mention one thing, that we are really not surprised to see this increasing attack, you know, against even Korean immigrant business owners, right? Other Asian business owners and also other people, because even before the unrest, as I documented in my book, Korean immigrant business owners, they were not treated well. They were, I would say that for whatever reasons, very hostile way, or you can say really, very shabby way, because of the way they look, or because of the way they talk, when they didn't speak fluent English. So, I mean, I already mentioned how many merchants they were killed and robbed and beaten, but I think so it's in a way, in the kind of continuity, I would say that, but maybe now public is noticing, I would say.
That's a great point, and I really appreciate how you put into perspective a lot of these complexities, and by relating incidents from the 90s to now. That actually leads to my next question about how much of your interview data and ethnography takes place in the early to mid 1990s, so immediately before and after the civil unrest in Los Angeles, when the demographics and politics of LA and the US were much different than they are now. How do you think your studies methodology and findings might differ if most of your data were collected over the past, let's say, 5-10 years?
Yeah, I think in terms of methodology, I would say that those days I had a team of multiracial research assistant. So I mean, I thought that it was valid that people have a right to be studied, interviewed by the researcher that they can trust. And in 1990s, really, that was difficult, okay? Because of, after this kind of sentence that people in South LA, they were outraged, right? At the sentence, and they demanded they need to be studied by the people that they can trust. So I had to match race and ethnicity of my research assistant with the people that I am studying, okay? So the idea is African-American interviewees need to be studied by African-American researcher, and Latinos by Latino, and Korean immigrant merchant, mostly I conducted an interview, but I don't think that is the case now. I mean, right now, it isn't that polarized. I mean, because right now, my students, even some of them are from South LA, and they couldn't believe that I wrote a book about their neighborhood, or where they grew up. They can literally point out, where the store is located. But I think, in the 1990s, even after the unrest, I recommended to both African-American and Korean-American student group on UCLA campus that why don't you guys, two groups meet together, have some kind of dialogue, right? But the Korean-American student group, they was telling me that, because we have many on UCLA campus, they were telling me that they tried it, but African-American student group, they don't feel they are ready, They said that they will have to do their own soul searching. And, Black orientation is not the most only important issue, you see, for African-Americans. So they said that they need time, okay? That was in 1990s. But, after a few decades passed, right? And now my student, African-American student, when I talk about Black orientation, they will say that they were surprised. Was there attention? You see, I mean, so really, as time goes by, there are pros and cons, you see. I mean, because in the past, even for the Korean merchant, because some of them, they experienced it personally. So it is hard to move beyond their personal experiences, because some of them, they are physically attacked, during the unrest, So it was really difficult to move beyond the personal experience. And also because since the Black Korean tension has been reified, so even for African Americans, they just assumed that there would be a tension, but now it's different. Now I have to explain that, yes, there is a so-called tension, and they want me to explain what was the tension was about, So they were actually intrigued when they read my book, and then it's kind of refreshing because they were saying that, oh, they really appreciated there is a Korean merchant who really cared about, so much concerned about African American customers, So I think, back to your question, in the 90s, researchers, even filmmakers, they had a difficulty because really at the time, African American customers and residents, they were hostile towards anybody who looked like Koreans or Asians, You can't really talk to them, but now it's different, and then now South LA become predominantly Latino neighborhood, and African American neighborhood is disappearing, and schools are closing because middle-class African Americans moved out, I would say that. So I think now really in terms of research method, in some senses, it would be easier, I would say that, but those days really, it was a challenge, I would say that. And then my research findings, I would say that I think because I conducted my follow-up research actually in year 2002. So like chapter 5 was really for a year. So it was based on the follow-up observation, okay? And in my book, I tried to update at least year 2010, I would say, okay? But I think in the meantime, South LA went through so much gentrification, particularly below USC area, and everywhere, where they had, CCTV, like surveillance camera is installed, even a small donut shop, I mean, Starbucks or everything. And so I think it really, went for securitization, of the neighborhood. And I would say that, as I already mentioned, very much diversified race and ethnicity of the merchant. So right now it is, it has become South Asian American. Right after the unrest, I noticed that South Asian Americans, Pakistani, they bought the businesses from Korean owned, Korean owner, okay? So South Asian American or Southeast Asian or Latino businesses, okay? I mean, unfortunately, although I would say that Black Korean tension has been contained, you haven't heard this actually. Okay, for the past 30 years, we haven't heard really Black Korean tension. There is a maybe small like boycott or protest, but it didn't last long. Okay, so really we all agree that Black Korean tension has been contained. It wasn't like we were able to put an end to it, but it has been contained. Okay, but I think really. What is more important here is even for the Latinos in the 90s, they were being harassed by old established residents such as African Americans, and they were given hard time, but not anymore. I think now even African-American community-based organizations, because South LA has been a hub of African-American community, you know, so historically. So now Latinos has been integrated. I mean, that is the lesson that we got, everybody took from the unrest, you know. So Latinos has been more or less like integrated and mainstream. And there is a lot of Black, brown, you know, Latino, Black coalition building and really civic engagement and social movement, I would say that. So I think that we can really talk about here. And I think one interesting episode was when I returned, you know, in the 90s, the really Korean-owned liquor store was a target, because historically, people in South LA, they have not been able to get rid of or reduce the number of liquor stores since the 1960s, okay? And unfortunately, people thought the Koreans increased the number of liquor stores, but they didn't, you know? But anyway, when I returned, then I found out that one issue was, because increasingly we had Central American, right? And Mexican immigrants in South LA. The issue was about chicken running around on the street, you know, because Central Americans, they are selling live chicken on the street. So that became a issue. Okay, so yeah, so much has changed. So I would say that, yeah, unfortunately, still now, among like 30,000, near 30,000 Korean immigrant business owners who became a victim, right? Riot victim, right? And many, I don't know what percentage of them still, many of those Korean business owners, still they don't, unfortunately, they don't understand why their businesses were looted and burnt and destroyed, even now, you know, because they got along well with their even African-American customers, you see. So, I mean, the question is, how come the so-called Black Korean tension has been extended to entire really population of Korean Americans, you know, and the problem with the Korean girls, Sunja-do, has been extended to entire Korean American community, you know. So, but then at the same time, although I saw Black Korean relation has been improved, particularly between Korean merchant and African American customers, you know, because I think, for instance, Korean merchant, they replaced their Latino employees with African American employees, you see, and they just try to treat their customers better, like a king, you know. And African Americans also apologized and felt sorry for Korean merchants, what happened to them, okay? And Korean merchants very much appreciated the fact that African American customers, they felt sorry to what happened to them, right? So I see, you know, in many senses that race relations has been improved, but even so, these days, unfortunately, there are African Americans who feels a bit disrespected when they patronize Korean-owned businesses, you know. Unfortunately, there are cases, so there is also a challenge, I would say that, yeah.
Okay. So we're technically over time, so we will have to end here, unfortunately. Thank you so much for your generosity, the talk and the conversation. Thank you to everyone who tuned in today. And of course, a special thanks to today's speaker, Dr. Kyeyoung Park. A recording of today's talk will be available shortly after on the Glint website. To those who tuned in, who are tuning in right now or tuned in before tomorrow, please note that there is still one event remaining in the Revisiting the LA Riots 30 Years Later series, the screening and discussion of Justin Chan's indie film Gook from 4:30 to 6:30 p.m. Friday, tomorrow, at University Center 302. I hope to see you all at that event. With that said, we'll go ahead and end it here. Thank you again, Dr. Kyeyoung Park, for your presentation. Thank you for conversation. Just thank you in general. We'll end it there.
Thank you very much, and really for your engagement with my work. Okay, thank you.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you.
Have a nice day. Okay, all right.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.